All right, welcome to another deep dive with us. You know how this works by now. We take one of your
And
sources.
dive deep into it.
Exactly. And today's a good one. We're looking at practical theology, specifically through the lens of discipleship.
Sounds intriguing. What's our source material for this?
So we're going to be drawing primarily from Nonzi's book, Practical Theology, as Discipleship 21
21 age, for those of us who don't read Chinese.
Right. Think of it as the scene of 21st century discipleship, new explorations in practical theology.
So kind of setting the scene for how we live out our faith today. And Do, he's...
A really interesting figure. Born in Taiwan,
Okay.
but then got his MDiv and a PhD in practical theology from Fuller Seminary here in the U.S.
All right, so bridging those worlds already, East and West.
And it continues, right? He's pastored churches in both Los Angeles and Taiwan.
Wow. So he's really lived and breathed these different contexts.
Totally. And that's not all. He's also super involved in theological education, public dialogue, all sorts of things.
So he's not just an academic, he's putting these ideas into practice, engaging with the world.
Precisely. And that's what makes this deep dive so relevant for everyone listening, I think. It's about understanding what practical theology actually is.
Not just some abstract theory.
Right, but something that has a real impact on how we live our lives, how we follow Jesus in this day and age.
So it's about discipleship then, at its core.
That's the heart of it. And Noon's work is all about making connections, right? Bridging those gaps we often feel between theory and practice.
Between the theologians and us everyday folks just trying to live out our faith.
Yeah. And even between the mission of the church as a whole and what we do in our individual lives.
It even touches on how our faith interacts with the wider world.
Exactly. Like, how do we live out the gospel in a society that doesn't always share our values?
Now, that's a question I think we all grapple with. So it's no surprise that this book has resonated with people from across the theological spectrum.
You're right. Big names like Mark Lau Branson and Andrew Root, but also figures from within the Chinese church context like Diet.
So a diverse range of perspectives finding common ground in these ideas. That's pretty remarkable.
It speaks to how important these issues are, for sure. Like Mark Lau Branson talks about how no-practice approach helps us to see where God is already at work in the world.
To recognize God's action in the present.
That's it. And then you've got someone like No, who emphasizes how this book really helps bridge that gap we often feel between theology and actually living out our faith.
Especially within the Chinese church context.
Yeah. Okay, so let's get into it. The phrase itself, practical theology, always strikes me as kind of funny.
How so?
Well, like, isn't all theology supposed to be, in some sense, practical?
You mean it should have some bearing on how we live our lives?
Yeah, like, what's the point if it just stays up in the clouds? And the book itself even acknowledges this potential confusion.
It does. How so?
Honey actually uses this really memorable image. He says practical theology is like red bean ice without the red beans.
Oh, I get it. Like you're expecting one thing.
But then it's not quite what you thought.
Yeah, like something's missing. So how does he fill in that missing piece? How does he define practical theology?
He starts with the word discipleship.
Discipleship. Okay, that makes sense.
But he goes deeper than that. For him, it's about this active process of discerning the actions of the triune God in the present within the church community, being transformed by participating in it, and interpreting the gospel in the space and time we are in.
Wow, that's quite a mouthful. But it's active, right? It's not passive. We're not just sitting around waiting for something to happen.
Exactly. And notice how he puts God at the center. It's about recognizing what God is already doing and joining in.
So it's less about us trying to make theology relevant and more about seeing how God is already making theology relevant.
I like that. And it speaks to why I think people are drawn to this idea. It's not about some abstract theory. It's about our lived experience of faith in the here and now.
The present moment. Okay, so if practical theology is about discipleship, about living out our faith today, why even bother with the theology part?
Right. Like some people might think, isn't theology just for academics? What does it have to do with me?
And honestly, there's a historical reason why some people, especially within the Chinese church, might feel that way.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about that.
So the book delves into this idea that theology is useless. And this sentiment really gained traction in the early 20th century in China.
What was going on at that time that led to this kind of thinking?
Well, it was a period of huge social and political upheaval. You had the May 4th movement with its strong focus on national identity and modernization.
A real push for change.
And also a growing anti-Christian sentiment, fueled in part by the perception that Christianity was tied to Western imperialism.
Ah, so Christianity was seen as a foreign influence, a threat to Chinese identity.
Exactly. And the big question on everyone's mind was, how can China become strong?
So where did Christian thought fit into all of this?
The book highlights two main responses from Chinese Christians at the time.
Okay, lay them on me.
First, you had the social gospel movement. They believed that national strength would come from building strong moral character, working for social reform, really embodying Christ's love in action.
So a focus on social justice and action.
Right. The second response was conservative fundamentalism. They emphasized personal conversion and individual devotion to Christ as the primary way to redeem the nation.
So more of an inward focus on personal salvation.
Yeah, with the idea that personal sin was at the root of societal problems.
And the book is suggesting that neither of these approaches fully address the complex issues facing China at that time.
That's the implication. It wasn't that these approaches were inherently wrong.
But they maybe weren't sufficient on their own.
Right. They didn't quite capture the whole picture. And in this context, a key figure discussed in the book talks about the rise of anti-intellectualism in the Chinese church.
Anti-intellectualism, so rejection of thinking itself.
Not exactly. It wasn't against rationality per se, but there was a suspicion of deep, abstract theological reflection.
So a preference for action over contemplation.
In a way, yes. And Deva identifies three main roots of this anti-intellectualism.
Oh, okay, I'm curious. What were they?
First, he points to pietism, which emphasizes personal experience of God over established doctrines.
So feeling God's presence more important than understanding theological concepts.
Yeah. And while that focus on personal experience is important, taken to an extreme, it can lead to devaluing the historical and intellectual foundations of our faith.
Right, because those doctrines and traditions have emerged from centuries of wrestling with the big questions about God.
Exactly. Then the second influence is fundamentalism.
Which we should clarify means.
Right. It's not just about being a fundamentalist in the way we often use that word today. Historically, it was a movement that defended the authority of the Bible against liberal interpretation.
Okay, so upholding the traditional understanding of Scripture.
Yeah. But the problem was, in their attempt to protect the Bible from what they saw as dangerous new ideas, they sometimes discouraged open theological inquiry.
So it became more about sticking to preset answers than continuing to wrestle with questions.
That's it. And finally, the third influence he points to is revivalism.
Ah, that makes sense. The big tent revivals, fiery preachers.
Exactly. Think of figures like Sada. The focus was on immediate spiritual encounters, conversions, emotional experiences.
Which is powerful, for sure.
Absolutely. But the problem was, sometimes this emphasis on immediate experience came at the expense of deeper theological education.
So it was more about the feeling than the understanding.
Right. And the book argues that all of this contributed to this idea that theology is somehow useless. But ironically, this dismissal of theology can have some unintended negative consequences.
Oh, how so?
Well, if we reject theology altogether, it can actually lead to certain interpretations, especially those coming from charismatic leaders being treated as absolute truth.
Because there's no framework for critically examining them.
Exactly. Without a strong foundation of theological reflection, there's less space for internal critique and renewal within our faith.
It's like saying we don't need to understand how a car engine works.
Just trust the driver.
But what if the driver's lost? Or taking us in the wrong direction?
That's a great analogy. Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about another central tension that the book addresses, the separation between theological theory and the actual practice of faith.
Yeah. I think a lot of us, regardless of our background, can relate to that. Like, what does all this heady stuff have to do with my everyday life?
Exactly. And Nolan uses this vivid image to illustrate this divide. He talks about the Chuhan contention.
Chuhan contention.
Yeah.
Okay, for those of us who didn't grow up with Chinese history.
Right. So imagine a chessboard, a clear dividing line right down the middle.
Okay, I'm visualizing it.
He uses this to represent the perceived gap between seminary professors and pastors.
Ah, so on one side, you've got the academics, the ones up in their ivory towers.
Yeah. They're dealing with all the theory, the complex concepts.
And on the other side, you've got the pastors,
who are down in the trenches dealing with real people's problems.
And never the twain shall meet.
Right. It's this idea that the academics might say, well, that's a question for someone who's actually doing ministry.
And the pastor might think, that's way too academic for me. Ask the scholars.
Exactly. But no one argues that this one-way street from theory to practice just doesn't hold up.
It's not that simple.
Right. He proposes a much more dynamic relationship, more like a practice theory practice cycle, or even a spiral.
So it's not just that theory informs practice.
No. It's that practice also informs theory.
So our lived experience should be feeding back into our theological understanding.
Precisely. And he uses this phrase, entering the scene. Genuine theological thinking doesn't just observe from a distance.
It jumps right into the mix.
Exactly. And he even quotes another prominent Chinese theologian, Jay, to back this up.
What does Jay say?
He emphasizes that theology is different from, say, established creeds and doctrines, those statements of belief that have gone through formal church approval.
Right. Theology is more fluid.
Yeah, it's more personal. It has more freedom.
So it's not just about reciting what we've been told to believe.
It's about individuals grappling with these big questions about God in their own context.
It's a living process.
Exactly. So ultimately, this book is trying to tear down that artificial wall between thinking deeply about our faith and actually living it out.
Especially in the Chinese church context.
Yeah, it's about recognizing that theological reflection isn't just for a select few. It's an essential part of how we all grow as disciples.
Love that. Okay, so the book highlights some examples of theologians who really embody this idea of entering the scene. Who are some of these folks who put this into practice?
Well, one of the first figures he discusses is Karl Barth, super influential theologian.
Okay, yeah, I've heard the name.
Now, Barth was a pastor in Switzerland working among factory workers, and he was really struck by how the liberal theology of his day just wasn't speaking to the real struggles and injustices that his congregation was facing.
It wasn't addressing their lived reality.
Exactly. So this led him back to a deeper engagement with Scripture, and eventually this resulted in his monumental work, the Epistle to the Romans, a foundational text for modern theology.
Wow. So his theology wasn't just abstract theorizing, it was born out of his pastoral experience.
Exactly, a real desire to serve his community. And another example he gives is Jürgen Moltmann.
Okay, and another big name in theology.
Yeah, and Moltmann's life was marked by profound experiences. He was a prisoner of war during World War II.
Wow, that must have shaped his worldview in a pretty significant way.
Absolutely. And then later, he worked as a pastor with farmers. And these experiences really shaped his theological perspective.
Interesting. So what did he emphasize?
He really stressed the importance of grounding theology in the lived experiences and the hopes of the people you're serving.
So connecting faith to their daily realities.
Yeah. And the book also highlights some important voices from Hong Kong.
Okay, like who?
Well, there's Youth, who was deeply involved in working with industrial workers. And through that experience, he developed this concept of the sinned against.
The sinned against.
It highlights how people can be victims of systemic injustice. It's a critique of what he called structural sin, and his work gained international recognition.
So it wasn't just a local issue, it was something that resonated with people around the world.
Right, showing the power of theology that emerges from a specific context of struggle.
Really powerful. Who else from Hong Kong does the book mention?
Another key figure is Selisha, who is known for developing what's called local theology, really rooted in the unique experience of Hong Kong.
Local theology. So a theology that emerges from a specific place and its particular challenges.
Exactly. And a key example of his work is his reconciliation theology, which he developed in response to the 1997 handover of Hong Kong from British to Chinese rule.
So a theology that addressed the specific anxieties and hopes of that historical moment.
Precisely. He's a great example of doing theology that grapples directly with the social and political realities of a specific time and place.
I love that. Okay, so all of these examples show that theology isn't meant to be just an abstract exercise. It needs to engage with the world. And the West also emphasizes the need for practical wisdom to bridge this gap between theory and practice.
Yes. And the term they use, practical wisdom, is particularly relevant within the Chinese philosophical tradition, with its emphasis on practical reason.
Right, so it's not just about having head knowledge. It's about knowing how to act wisely in the world. So how does the book define practical wisdom? What does that actually look like?
Well, drawing on thinkers like Christian B. Sharon and Kathleen A. Cahalan, The book describes practical wisdom as a kind of embodied knowledge. It involves our ability to perceive situations accurately, make sound judgments, and then act effectively.
So it's not just about being smart, it's about knowing how to act wisely.
Exactly. And this is something that's learned through experience. It's not something you can just read in a book.
You gotta get your hands dirty.
Right. And the book highlights that practical wisdom involves things like understanding narratives, using our imagination, exercising discernment.
So it's not just about cold, hard logic.
No. It's about having a holistic view, being able to see things from different perspectives, being part of a community, and having a strong moral compass.
And how we actually cultivate this practical wisdom. Where does it come from?
The book stresses the importance of being connected both to God and to our community. We need to learn from the traditions of our faith.
The wisdom that's been passed down through generations.
Exactly. But we also need the collective wisdom of the people around us. Thinkers like Bass and Cahalan, who are cited in the book, really emphasize this relational aspect.
So it's not about isolating ourselves and trying to figure it all out on our own.
No. It's about being in dialogue with others, learning from their experiences.
It's a communal process.
Exactly. And the book also brings up this idea of ein, this idea of being conversant with current affairs.
Okay, so being aware of what's going on in the world around us.
Yeah.
How does that tie into practical wisdom?
Well, that concept comes from 1 Chronicles 12.32, which describes these leaders from the tribe of Issachar who understood the times and knew what Israel should do.
Oh, interesting.
And the book highlights how this understanding wasn't just intellectual, it was also relational. It was about having the discernment to recognize God's will and knowing how to act wisely in changing circumstances.
So being informed, but also discerning.
Exactly. Not just knowing the facts, but knowing what they mean, what they point to. And this idea of listening and acting wisely connects back to Jesus' own teaching, right?
Oh, absolutely. Think of the Beatitudes. Those aren't just nice sayings. They're a guide for how to live in a way that reflects God's values.
Right. And in the Sermon on the Mount, you have that parable of the wise and foolish builders.
The one who built his house on the rock.
Exactly. Jesus emphasizes that it's not enough to just hear his words, you have to put them into practice. That's where the wisdom comes in.
So practical wisdom is about engaging our minds, our hearts, and our actions. And all of that is informed by our relationship with God and with our community.
Right. It's a holistic approach to discipleship.
Now, the book also spends some time discussing the challenges posed by the modern world, this crisis of control that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. And I think this is where it gets really relevant for us today.
Okay, tell me more about this crisis of control.
Well, the book starts this section with a really interesting anecdote from Eugene Peterson's autobiography. Eugene Peterson, the guy who translated The Message.
Oh, right. I love The Message.
So Peterson talks about these monthly reports he had to submit to his denomination.
Bureaucracy.
Yeah.
The bane of every pastor's existence.
Right. So Peterson was diligently filling out all these reports, tracking numbers and statistics.
Attendance, giving, all.
Yeah. But then, just to see what would happen, he started adding these increasingly absurd confessions to his reports.
Like what?
Oh, things like, I often spend too much time staring at squirrels, or I have a secret desire to run away and join the circus.
No one.
Nope. No one seemed to bat an eye. They were so focused on the numbers that they completely missed the deeper, more personal stuff.
That's both hilarious and kind of depressing.
Right. And that's exactly the point Peterson was trying to make. This obsession with quantifiable data can actually eclipse our concern for the deeper spiritual health and well-being of both pastors and congregations.
Yeah, it's like we're so busy measuring things that we forget to actually care for people.
Exactly. And this leads into a discussion of some of the defining characteristics of the modern world.
Okay, what are those?
Yeah.
How does the book describe the modern world?
It points to this strong fixation on control and measurable outcomes. We want to be able to predict and manage everything.
Like church growth have to be quantifiable.
Right. And we prioritize things like church size and financial figures over the less tangible but more crucial aspects of the kingdom of God and the health of the community.
Because those things are harder to measure.
Exactly. And another key characteristic is this emphasis on functional value. We tend to view people and things primarily in terms of their usefulness rather than their inherent worth.
Yeah, like what can this person do for me? How can this thing benefit me?
Right. And the book acknowledges that this pressure to measure and optimize everything is something we all feel. It's just part of the air we breathe in the modern world.
And it even talks about different modern worldviews, right? Like how people try to make sense of all this.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It introduces 4 key modern worldviews, drawing on the work of Goudsword and Bartholomew. There's the classical modern worldview, which is all about progress, technology, the free market, lots of optimism there.
Okay. And then,
Then there's the structural critical modern worldview, which emphasizes the need for radical social change to address systemic inequalities.
so a more critical perspective on power structures.
Right. Then you have the cultural critical modern worldview, which focuses on the need for individual transformation, changes in our beliefs and values.
More of an inward focus.
Yeah. And finally, there's the postmodern worldview, which is characterized by a kind of disillusionment with grand narratives, a skepticism towards any claims of absolute truth.
More of a relativistic perspective.
Exactly. So these are just different lenses through which people interpret the challenges of our time. And practical theology, the book argues, has emerged in part as a response to the crises brought about by these modern worldviews.
It's trying to find a way forward in the midst of all this complexity.
Right. And the book specifically mentions 3 key developments that have shaped the modern world, drawing on the work of Gerben Haitink. The first is this emphasis on the autonomous individual, the enlightened subject, who determines their own meaning and purpose.
Individualism.
Exactly. Then there's the rise of the technological society through industrialization, this idea that we can control and manipulate the world through technology.
And that's not always a good thing.
Well, it's certainly something we need to be critical of. And then finally, there's the modernization of society itself, which leads to all sorts of rapid social and cultural changes.
So practical theology is wrestling with all of these forces that are shaping our world.
Precisely. Okay, let's zoom in on one of those forces that you just mentioned. The Enlightenment. It had a huge impact on theological thought.
Okay, remind me. The Enlightenment, what was that all about again?
So the Enlightenment, broadly speaking, was this period in European history that really emphasized reason, individual autonomy, the power of the human mind to understand the world.
Like science and logic over tradition and superstition.
Yeah. Immanuel Kant, one of the key figures of the Enlightenment, famously said, "Dare to know." It was this call to use reason to understand the world rather than just accepting things on faith.
So a real shift in how people thought about knowledge and authority.
Exactly. And this had some pretty significant implications for theology.
Okay, how so?
Well, for one thing, it led to a questioning of traditional religious authority. If human reason is the ultimate arbiter of truth, then why should we accept the teachings of the church or the Bible just because they've been around for a long time?
Right. We need to think for ourselves.
Exactly. And the book actually quotes Peter Gay, who described Enlightenment thinkers as essentially modern pagans.
Pagans, wow, that's pretty strong language.
Yeah. But his point was that they were prioritizing reason and scientific inquiry over traditional religious authority.
So a real shift in allegiance.
Right. But the book also acknowledges that not everyone saw this as a positive development.
Okay, what were some of the critiques of this way of thinking?
Well, some thinkers, like Hauerwas and Willimon and Gadamer, pointed to the dangers of the Enlightenment's tendency to break from tradition.
So losing that connection to the wisdom of the past.
Exactly. And they also warned against what they called a submission to technical thinking.
Technical thinking.
This idea that everything can be reduced to what can be measured and controlled.
Ah, that makes sense. And how does that relate to theology?
Well, if we only value what can be empirically proven or logically explained, then a lot of what we talk about in theology becomes suspect.
Right, because faith, by definition, goes beyond what we can see and touch.
Exactly. So the Enlightenment raised some really important questions about the relationship between faith and reason, tradition, and progress. And these are questions that we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely. Okay, so in this context of all these changes brought about by the Enlightenment, the book introduces Friedrich Schleiermacher as a pivotal figure in the development of practical theology.
Yeah, Schleiermacher is often called the father of practical theology. He was writing in the late 18th and early 19th centuries.
So right in the thick of the Enlightenment.
Exactly. And he was trying to find a way to make Christianity relevant in this new intellectual landscape.
Okay. So what did he do? What made him so important?
Well, first of all, in his work, Brief Outline on the Study of Theology, he systematically categorized theology into 3 branches: philosophical, historical, and practical.
So he gave practical theology a more defined place within the broader field of theological studies.
Right. He elevated its status. But perhaps more importantly, he argued that religious experience was foundational.
What does it mean?
He believed that our feelings and experiences of the divine were primary.
So not just intellectual assent to doctrines, but an actual felt sense of God.
Exactly. And he said that doctrines were really just attempts to articulate and understand these inner experiences.
So he was trying to ground theology in the lived reality of faith.
Precisely. And this was a direct response to the Enlightenment's emphasis on reason. He was saying, look, faith isn't just about intellectual arguments, it's about a personal encounter with the divine.
So he was trying to bridge the gap between faith and the modern mind.
Exactly. But the book also points out that not everyone agreed with Schleiermacher's approach.
Who disagreed with him?
Well, Karl Barth, who we talked about earlier, was one of his main critics. Barth was worried that by putting so much emphasis on human experience, Schleiermacher was opening the door to a human-centered theology.
So instead of God being the center of our faith, we make ourselves the center.
Right. And Barth saw this as a dangerous trend in liberal theology. He was really concerned about losing sight of God's sovereignty and grace.
So it's a delicate balance, isn't it? Trying to make faith relevant to contemporary culture without compromising the core of what we believe. Okay, so this has been a fascinating deep dive into Naurai's practical theology as discipleship. Let's take a minute to recap some of the key takeaways for our listeners.
Yeah, great idea.
So first of all, we saw how practical theology is not just about applying theological principles to our lives. It's fundamentally about discipleship. It's an active, ongoing process of recognizing where God is working in the world and joining in.
And we explored the historical context of the Chinese church and how this idea that theology is useless emerged. We saw how various cultural and intellectual factors contributed to that sentiment.
And then we looked at the importance of overcoming that divide between theological theory and the actual lived experience of faith.
This idea of entering the scene.
Right. Not just observing from a distance, but getting involved, getting our hands dirty.
And we talked about practical wisdom as a key to bridging that gap, this embodied knowledge that involves perception, judgment, and action. And it's something that we cultivate through our relationship with God and our community.
Right. And finally, we consider the challenges of the modern world, this crisis of control with its focus on measurable outcomes and functional value. And we touched on the lasting impact of the Enlightenment on theological thought.
And remember Dam-E's definition. Practical theology is this dynamic process within the church community, discerning the actions of the triune God in our present time, being transformed as we participate in those actions, and interpreting the gospel within our specific historical and cultural context.
It's a lot to chew on. So for those of you listening, here's a final thought to consider. Think about those seemingly ordinary decisions you make each day, the challenges you face. Those aren't just practical matters. They have deep theological dimensions. How might consciously entering the scene of your own life with a focus on discerning God's presence reshape your understanding of what it means to be a disciple?
That's a great question to ponder. And if you're intrigued by these ideas, I highly recommend checking out Nam-E's book, Practical Theology as Discipleship. It's a rich and rewarding exploration of this vital topic.
Thanks for joining us on another deep dive. Until next time.